Good morning, everyone. We're going to start in about 5 minutes. So if for whatever reason you haven't had a chance to sign in, please make sure you've signed in with the support staff. But we'll get going in about 5 minutes. Good morning, everybody. So I have 5 after 9. So I'm going to start by going through and reminding everybody, if you haven't already signed in with the front desk, please make sure you've signed in just so we can continue to communicate. I'm going to do an agenda run through real quick just so everyone knows how we've structured today. Obviously, we have a lot of material to cover. I think we've allocated more than sufficient time and we may run ahead of schedule, but we're going to do some introductions and ground rules to start out, followed by the overarching background. And generally, we're not going to be doing a whole lot of discussion on the background materials, but if there's questions on the background material or any part of it, please just raise your hand. By 10 o'clock, I hope we're actually going to start talking about some of the strategies associated with reducing CO2 emissions from electric generating units. And we're going to break this into electric generating unit discussions and non-electric generating units. So when I mean electric generating, I mean generating power, and then everything else. And we're also going to divide the morning. We're going to talk about those measures we think are feasible or potentially feasible in the short term. And then in the afternoon session or the later sessions, we're going to talk about some of the longer term strategies that will be needed in order to accomplish the Global Warming Response Act requirements. So if you could just scroll down just on the agenda. Okay, so just keep in mind, we have allocated quite a bit of time. Again, I'm anticipating that we're probably going to take a lunch break around 11:30, but we'll do a time check at that point to see where we are in the agenda. We have a very full day. Hopefully there'll be more than adequate time for everyone to express their opinions, suggestions, and questions in the time allotted. But even if we go beyond those time and we run out of time, there will be further opportunity that we'll discuss to provide your feedback to the department. And the first thing I just wanted to say is, you know, why is everybody here today? What we've asked everyone to come. We really are looking for everyone here to give us their information and inform the department on what you think are the pathways that we can reduce carbon emissions in New Jersey, keeping in mind the department's goals and the state's goals to have 80% reduction in CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 from our 2006 levels, and additionally, and we'll talk about this very briefly, to achieve 100% clean energy by 2050, the same time frame. So that's why we're here. We're looking for your feedback, and we're going to give you the opportunity as we go through the presentations to provide that feedback to the department. So the next point on the agenda is to do introductions and ground rules. So I want to introduce Tanya Osnowicz, who's going to be my partner up here today. But I'd like to give you all an opportunity to introduce yourselves. Starting off, I'm Frank Stites. I'm the Director of the Division of Air Quality in AQUES, and we'll go around the room now.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Ray. I am a representative for the New Jersey Student Sustainability Coalition. So I'm here representing the youth today, and I'm here to further the conversation with respect to environmental justice that I've done on my part and other areas therein. So happy to be here.
Maria Connolly, I'm here representing the Department of Community Affairs.
I'm Dan Hudson. I'm here representing Energy International.
Hi, good morning. I'm Trina Malik. I'm here with the Nature Conservancy New Jersey chapter.
Hello, everyone. My name is Henry Gaida. I'm the Policy Director with the New Jersey League of Conservation Voters.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Arcadia Lee with New Jersey Conservation Foundation.
Hi, I'm Klaus Rittenbach, Climate Action, New Jersey.
Good morning, I'm Shani Halevi from Covanta.
I'm Dave Owen from DEP Bureau of Stationary Sources.
Sue Dorward, I'm with Raritan Valley Community College in Branchburg, where we've been carbon neutral since 2017. And I also am a student at Columbia University studying carbon management and low carbon technology.
Doug O'Malley, Director of Environment, New Jersey.
Jeff Tittle, Senior Director, New Jersey Sierra Club.
Kim Scarborough, PSEG.
Good morning, Chris Gulix, PSENG.
Good morning, Alexis Bailey from Kaufman Zeta Group.
Adrian Kimbrough, the VP with Gable Associates, an energy and environmental consulting firm, and we're here on behalf of the IEPNJ, which is a trade association representing New Jersey's independent energy generators.
Satish Pushpa, Phillips 66 Bay Refinery. Good morning. I'm Adam Beam from the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission's Office of Energy and Climate Change Initiatives.
Good morning. I'm Bill O'Sullivan, retired DEP. I used to be Frank Stites. I'm here for entertainment. I don't represent anybody.
Hi, I'm Scott Dubin with the DEP Forest Fire Service.
Ray Cantor, New Jersey Business and Industry Association.
Toby Hanna from ERM.
Glenn D'Antuno, representing Speedway.
Margot Carr, South Jersey Industries.
Grant Lucking with the New Jersey Builders Association.
Gerald Foley, representing the Department of Energy's CHP Technical Assistance Partnership.
Brian Toro with Mercury Public Affairs.
Nicholas Kikis with the New Jersey Apartment Association.
Bruce Catcher, I'm with Mako Gold Catcher and Fox Environmental and Energy Law Firm. Today I'm representing the Chamber of Commerce, Southern New Jersey.
I'm Tom Duncan, also with the law firm of Mako Gold Catcher and Fox.
Morning, everyone. Mike Eggington, New Jersey State Chamber of Commerce, and also a member of the New Jersey Clean Air Council, an advisory body here at DEP.
Hi, Hannah Thonay, Energy Policy at the Board of Public Utilities.
James Brown, Hydrogen Fuel Cell Council.
Eric DeJezero, Fuel Merchants Association of New Jersey. And Frank, before we start, I have a global big picture ground rule question.
Good morning. My name is Carol Beck. I'm from New Jersey Resources.
Good morning. My name is Yasmin Pessar. I'm with Insight Civil Engineering, and I'm here representing the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey.
Eric Benson, Clean Water Action.
Hi, I'm Matt Polsky. These days I'm a PhD student in the Netherlands, Erasmus University. But many years ago, I helped to catalyze DEP's initial interest in climate change and was part of, co-led or led several of the DEP sustainability initiatives.
Bob Bissett with the Council of Industrial Boiler Owners.
Good morning, Elvin Montero with the Chemistry Council of New Jersey.
Hello, I'm Eric Miller, the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Morning, Judy Minot from Sierra Club, New Jersey.
Maura Blau, attorney with Greenbaum, Rosesmith and Davis.
Elizabeth Stein, Environmental Defense Fund.
Good morning, Rich Bankowski, Rutgers University.
Tom McNevin, DEP Staff Scientist in Air Quality, Energy and Sustainability.
I'm Kim McAvoy, also DEP Climate and Flood Resilience Program.
Dave Pringle, I'm on the Empower New Jersey Steering Committee and also Cranford Green Team and Environmental Commission.
Tom Johnson, NJ Spotlight.
Nancy Griffith, Unitarian Universalist Faith Action.
Lisa Fleming, Vineland Municipal Electric.
Bashir Bouzid, DEP Program.
Good morning, Sean Moriarty, DEP Chief Advisor, Regulatory Affairs.
Good morning, Bob Kettig, Assistant Director of Climate Change, Clean Energy and Sustainability.
Good morning, everyone. Paul Orlando, Director of Climate, Clean Energy and Radiation Protection.
Christine Schall, DEP, Air Quality, Energy and Sustainability.
Morning, everyone, and thanks for coming again. Paul Baldoff, Assistant Commissioner, Air Quality, Energy and Sustainability.
So at this point, Eric, you asked for a question on the ground rules. So if it's okay, we were going to do ground rules a little bit later, but I think maybe it's appropriate to do the ground rules now before, or? It's our meeting. Okay. Actually, it's your meeting. I'm just here to start the discussion. Okay. So what I'm going to do then, if it's okay with everybody, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through some background. We'll ask for questions on the background, and then before we get into the larger presentations, we will go through the ground rules at that point. So, Neil, if you could pull up the presentation and just make sure this works. Okay. All right, it works. What do you know? As I mentioned before, the focus of today's meeting is to solicit your input in developing potential pathways to reduce carbon emissions in New Jersey, and focusing in on reducing emissions 80% from the 2006 levels by 2050, and also 100% clean energy by 2050. And by way of background, what we have is the governor and the BPU have released the Energy Master Plan. And the Energy Master Plan has driven three very important items. We have the Executive Order 100 from Governor Murphy, which lays out those goals that the Department of Environmental Protection needs to put in place to facilitate the transition to a lower carbon intense New Jersey. The commissioner has issued an administrative order to issue the New Jersey Pact, or Protecting Against Climate Threats rules, of which this is one of those rules, and that's why we're here today for stakeholdering. So this is sort of how things are aligning with the Energy Master Plan and the stakeholder meeting for the rules we are here today. So it's important to note that while the Energy Master Plan was released last month, and it outlined strategies to overall get us to 80% reductions from 2006 levels by 2050, there's some pretty significant targeted reductions in emissions. And again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but this is actually out of the Energy Master Plan, which if you haven't had an opportunity to review, read, please do so, because it's informing everything that the department, or a large part of what the department is trying to do in reducing emissions. As you can see, there's a lot of reductions that are projected. Our business as usual will not get us to 80% reduction by 2050. All right. I'm not getting anything. Why is this not working? All right. So what is New Jersey Pact? New Jersey Pact directed the department to adopt regulatory reforms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and climate adaptation. As I mentioned, in response to that executive order, Commissioner McCabe issued an administrative order this year, her first of the year, directing the department to propose regulations that establish criteria that govern and reduce emissions of carbon dioxide within 12 months, and then, if appropriate, adopt the same within 24 months. So our schedule for this rulemaking is to propose emission reduction rules by next January and adopt those within 12 months thereafter. So again, we want everyone to come in today because we have to look to the future and consider all those opportunities we have to reduce emissions. And the factors that we have to take into account, and again, I'm not saying what the weighting is on any of these, there's a lot of factors, including risk associated with activities in different locations of the state, as well as the cost effectiveness of sustainable solutions. So these are the overarching boundaries that we're going to be using in developing these rules. And again, this is a suite of many rules. A lot of you were here last Friday when we were talking about the greenhouse gas reporting rule. Today we're talking about the carbon dioxide, carbon rules, and there will be land use rules coming up for stakeholdering too. And we encourage you all to participate in that process. In general, the department's initial thinking is that this rulemaking should look at CO2 emission reductions that can be achieved by electric generating units and stationary non-electric generating units that are already permitted by the department. So the department has very clear authority to regulate and place requirements of air pollution on permitted sources. So our initial thinking is looking at those domain of sources that have air permits already from the department, rather than developing a new permitting program for sources that may not have an air permit. Are there any questions so far in anything that I've presented? I'm going to go through a couple more slides, but I want to make sure that we're all on common. So Dave,
Yeah, we still have to do ground rules, but if you don't mind stating your name and who you represent. We do need to use microphones. We are being Skyped, so just don't begin your comments until one of us gets to you with a microphone.
David Pringle, Cranford Environmental Commission in Empower, New Jersey. What percentage of the greenhouse gas inventory, I know we're still working off, we don't have the hard numbers yet, but what percentage of the universe of greenhouse gases do you think you're getting at if you're only looking at existing permitted sources?
I'm not sure if I have that number at hand, Dave, but we're talking, and I'm going to get further into what sources we're talking about, but we're talking the EGU piece, and this is all in the greenhouse gas inventory from 2018, and we can try to get you an answer at a break, but we're talking about industrial sources, institutional, potentially residential, and electric generating. So we're not speaking necessarily to any, at this rulemaking, those non-CO2 emissions associated with stationary sources, and we're not looking at mobile sources as part of this rulemaking. But everything else is on the table.
Other comment or questions, just for clarity on what he just talked about? If you could say.
Sue Dorward, Raritan Valley Community College. Are you considering natural climate solutions or other things that are not generation related?
So sequestration, that sort of thing. This rulemaking is not intended to address sequestration from non-stationary sources. So not that the department isn't considering those, not that we're trying to inventory those sources, natural carbon sinks. If there is a control technology that allows for sequestration of emissions, anthropogenic emissions, we would consider that. But most likely not part of this rulemaking.
Frank, what residential sources are currently permitted?
Currently, residential sources, multifamily dwellings with combustion units greater than 1 million BTU per hour.
Okay.
Okay.
Jeff Tittle, Sierra Club. So we're not going to be looking at fugitive emissions or life cycle, just very clearly the permitted sources.
The traditional air pollution control program, yes. All right. So I want to get a little more specific now in the background before we get into ground rules. And again, to put things in perspective, I want to acknowledge the fact that currently, for electric generating units, the department has re-entered RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, for existing sources. And the EMP basically signaled, if you all have read through it, that additional regulations of CO2 emissions might be necessary to meet the emission reductions. So again, this particular stakeholdering process actually is called out on page 113 of the EMP. If you haven't gotten that far through it yet, I did. And so that's one of the reasons we're here. I think EGUs are pretty well understood, but I want to talk about what do I mean by non-EGU stationary sources. Generally speaking, combustion and steam sources that are used in the commercial, industrial, institutional, and residential sector. And again, to clarify for the residential sector, we're looking at those sources that are generally permitted. So when we permit a apartment building boiler or an apartment building engine generating electricity, those are the sources that we're looking at. Institutional sources, the example would be schools with large boilers, hospitals, office buildings. Industrial sector would run the gamut: manufacturing, refining, industrial type operations. And the commercial sector obviously can be things like shopping malls and other sources. And these are the sources that are all traditionally already permitted by the department through its air permitting program. All right. And you may ask, how many of those sources do you have permitted? So here's a summary of the number of non-electric generating units with air permits in New Jersey. We have approximately, give or take, about 8,000 combustion units that are currently permit holders in the state of New Jersey. They run the gamut from boilers, engines, and there are some non-electric generating turbines. Keep in mind that we have probably a little over 100 electric generating units in the state at 33 facilities, but we have about 8,000 non-electric generating combustion units in the state. And that's the domain of sources that we are primarily looking at with this rulemaking. So I have a chance now to ask if there's any questions regarding anything that we've covered up to this point. Eric's got one in the back.
Eric, the Jezreel Fuel Merchants Association of New Jersey. Frank, my comment is about something that you haven't addressed. When we were here Friday, we did the greenhouse gas monitoring and reporting, and you handed out a copy of the Global Warming Response Act. Today, we're using CO2 interchangeably with greenhouse gas. We didn't hand out Section 42 of the law, which the governor amended over the summer, which said that it's greenhouse gases, it's not limited to CO2, and that we're going to look at short-term, i.e. methane and others. So why have we narrowed the focus from Friday greenhouse gas to today CO2? And was that a decision that the commissioner made relative to her administrative order, or is that a decision that's from the governor's office? Thank you.
So the administrative order lays out several rulemakings that have to proceed immediately. Friday's session was on the greenhouse gas reporting rule, and it is comprehensive for all greenhouse gases and short-lived climate pollutants. So that's clearly the focus of that rulemaking. That rulemaking is designed to gather sufficient information to allow for the regulation of all those sources that are being collected information on that will be in the emission inventory. This rulemaking is looking at carbon dioxide before we have the reporting information. Why? Because we already have most of this information. We have the ability to assess these sources now and to propose rules without waiting for the greenhouse gas reporting rule, which is, again, comprehensive. So we are looking exclusively at carbon dioxide emissions from combustion sources.
Ray Cantor, NJBIA. Two quick questions. Of the non-EGU sources, how many of those are individual permits versus general permits? And also, you had ruled out natural sequestration. Does that mean you're eliminating the possibility of mitigation?
Ray, if that's a comment that you'd like to make as part of this stakeholder, we would accept that comment.
And the first question?
How many sources, general permits versus non-general permits? I'm going to talk off the top of my head and say it's probably about less than 500 individual permits, and the remainder of them are general permits. So probably about 7,500 are in general permits, and then 500 are case-by-case permits.
Okay, we have a question here. Go ahead.
Grant Lucking with the Builders Association. Just to confirm, you're not looking at anything that's not currently permitted? And secondly, is there any discussion on changing thresholds for current permit requiring activities?
Not at this time. We are not planning on making changes to this at this time. Bill.
Okay. I'm going to follow up on Eric's comment on the non-greenhouse gases, and your schedule puts that 6 months after the CO2. So it's a blink of the eye. So my thought is to encourage the department to do one of these sessions sooner rather than later for particularly methane leaks and things of that nature. I think there's real promise in New Jersey setting a good example for non-greenhouse gases. CO2 is tough, but non-greenhouse gases, there's real opportunities there to make some reductions that have near-term benefit.
Thank you for the comment.
Matt Polsky, former new DEP sustainability team leader. Everything is, the framing here is very regulatory, rule-oriented. I have about 40 years worth of ideas to give you guys in whatever limited time there is later, but very few of them, if any, are on that frame. Am I in the right place today?
We look forward to the comments. And again, this is the department's, at least its initial thoughts. That's why we're coming to you now before we actually develop the rules. This is our thinking, and we want to get your feedback. We want to get everyone's feedback in terms of are we doing this right? Are we catching, are we considering what sources need to be considered? And as we get into the discussions, we're going to be talking about time framing. And just by way of introduction, the next couple of sessions, we're going to be talking about short-term measures, those things that can be accomplished in the short term, 3-5 years. And then we're going to be talking potential measures that can be accomplished in the long term, which could be anything from the end of those short-term measures all the way out to 30 years in 2050. So again, we're not trying to close off the discussion, but we're trying to give you what we think are those measures and those strategies and those timeframes that we think are feasible. But we need your feedback. So yes, you're still in the right space. All right.
Good.
Oh,
Yep.
Dave.
What am I missing? You're saying you have to cut 80% by 2050, but all of the things you've excluded, it's mathematically impossible. You're not even going to come close. Forget the 45% by 2030. More than half the emissions in the state aren't even included in this rule. How are you going to get there? What am I missing?
So Dave, and to be polite, we are not looking to reduce every single source sector by 80%. We may be able to reduce source sectors by greater than 80%. But what we're framing with this stakeholdering is looking at the industrial stationary sources. Yes, there are mobile sources, Dave, there are mobile sources that will have to be considered. But what we've been charged with by the commissioner is looking at CO2 emission reductions using the existing authorities in the Air Pollution Control Act. With regard to mobile sources, there are additional strategies that may be considered in the future. The department is engaged in litigation with the federal government to try to overturn Trump administration's rollback of greenhouse gas standards for mobile sources. But what we're doing here is we're focusing on that narrow industrial source sector, the institutional, the EGUs, that we already have those authorities, that we don't have to do new authorities to do.
You don't have the future. If you believe the science, you have 10 years. And on Friday, we learned the DEP's already missing their first legally mandated deadline that the governor signed into law 6 months ago. So Friday, we're learning you're already missing the first legally mandatory deadline. Today, we're learning you're not even addressing more than half the problem.
Hi.
It's impossible to see that you guys are serious on this.
Hi, Bob Kettig. Just to add to the comment on the difference between the point sources, which Frank is discussing here today, and the non-point sources, primarily transportation. I think what we have to look in the vein of, it's clear that the Energy Master Plan laid out a path where we're relying very heavily on electrification to decarbonize transportation. Also, we're going to be relying on electrification to decarbonize the heating of spaces as we go through the next 30 years. That is going to result in the need to get that electric generation from less carbon sources, eventually being carbon neutral sources. So I would look at the inventory and as far as where we are today from the industrial sector, from the electric generating sector, and say, okay, this is what it represents today, but in a future state where we're relying very heavily on electrification, the decisions we make now for transitioning to a less carbon-intensive industrial and electric generating sector are going to result in greater benefits as we go through, and we rely on that electrification to decarbonize the rest of our non-industrial, non-point sources.
I guess the point is, will there be rules coming out at some point on methane and other short-term carbons?
As we develop the information through the greenhouse gas reporting rule, I think on Friday we said that's going to inform that rulemaking effort, yes.
And then the other point is, a lot of these sources, you know, whether they're industrial or electric, fugitive emissions could be equal to what's coming out of the stack. Plus, then when you look at, you know, pipelines and leakage and bringing that gas to those gas generators, and,
right.
and you know, so I mean, you really can't get at it unless you get authority to go broader.
Frank, sorry, my
That's okay, Doug.
throat's still whatever. Doug O'Malley, Environment New Jersey. Just to follow up on that question, for those of us that weren't in the room on Friday, or for those of us that were like me and my mind's still full of information from Friday, this question on the process of moving forward with the rule to regulate methane and fugitive emissions is clearly critical. The Commissioner's administrative order references a carbon rule, references a timeline for next January and the January after to finalize that. Will the process on a methane rule be incorporated into that same timeline?
Doug, I can't say whether we're going to do methane rules in a year or not, but clearly the input we're getting from some stakeholders today is that it should be included in that rulemaking, and we will take that back.
Bill, you had your hand up. Are you good? Okay.
Thank you. Eric DeJezero. Frank, you had mentioned you're moving forward with what you have authority for. What is it that you don't think you have authority for? You had mentioned the Air Pollution Control Act. The Global Warming Response Act is the Air Pollution Control Act, and that it says no later than 1 year after the effective date of the amendment that the governor signed, the DEP in consultation with the BPU and any other agencies as appropriate shall prepare report recommending the measures necessary to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including short-lived climate pollutants. So what is the authority that the department is lacking currently? It sounds to me that that's the authority you need from the Air Pollution Control Act. And is it just a matter of your answer is simply you don't have an inventory of it, and that's why you're doing the inventory?
So when I say authority, I mean those traditional stationary sources that we regulate. We don't require air permits for your hot water heater at home. They're too small. The department has made a determination historically that that's not a significant source of emissions. What we're saying is, in order to regulate something out of our purview that we currently regulate, we would have to do additional rulemaking. And again, we will take input from this group if they think we should expand the permitting program. But what we're trying to communicate is that we are looking at an existing domain of sources. That existing domain of sources could be expanded based on information that we gather through the greenhouse gas emission inventory and the greenhouse gas monitoring and reporting rule. But at this point, in order to fast track this rule, we're looking at a somewhat narrow scope of sources and permitted. But again, generally speaking, there are things that are outside the purview of the Air Pollution Control Act. There's not many, but there are a few. That would require statutory changes. And we're not looking at necessarily doing statutory changes to the Air Pollution Control Act currently.
Jeff Tittle again. Are you looking at bringing CO2 in under the Title V program and not only be able to collect fees, but then also bring in reduction for the different stationary sources?
We're going to talk about that as we go along for short-term and long-term. So the first, if I can answer your question with a question, if you think we should, when I go through the presentation, please make those comments. But I think it's going to be obvious Jeff, that we are looking at establishing emission standards for stationary sources for CO2 direct emissions. And your second point on emission fees for CO2, we did hear that on Friday, and again, I would encourage you to make that comment again.
This follows up on the legislation. This particular slice of the strategy is fairly small, and you're talking about your effort right here, not changing legislation. I think there's something coming up in June where you need to identify what legislative changes are needed to do the job. And I would encourage the department to have what they call a bicycle rack, where these ideas on what legislative changes might be needed be put in that bicycle rack. And for example, there's legislation that says you can't consider advances in the art of air pollution control for new equipment if it's, I believe it's under 5 tons a year. And that's an area where you should significantly look at, whether or not a recommendation should be made to change that legislation to something lower, a lower threshold when you get a permit in the door, considering state-of-the-art in energy efficiency.
Thank you, Bill.
The global, David Pringle, Borough, New Jersey, the Global Warming Response Act gives you all the statutory authority you need. It says reduce greenhouse gases by 80%. It also defines greenhouse gases to include anything that contributes to climate change that DEP desires to designate. So black carbon, methane, HFCs, everything you have, you don't need to go back to the legislature. Yeah, I might have to do some rules to further define the definition of greenhouse gases, but you have the legal authority. You don't need additional statutory authority. And there are a lot of ways to be cutting greenhouse gases, and I assume that this rule would be a lot more than looking at individual permits. We're not suggesting you put a permit in everybody's gas furnace and everybody's gas dryer. There's a ton of different things you could be doing regulatorily to reduce greenhouse gases, separate from only looking at air permits from only existing sources and existing regulatory programs. And if you believe the science, you don't have time to wait 2 and 3 and 4 years to do more rules.
Klaus Rittenbach, Climate Action, New Jersey. Yes, I have the same concerns that Dave has, that you're only considering a small percentage of the overall emissions, and that we would prefer that you take the full advantage of whatever the Global Warming Response Act allows you to do.
Thank you. One more? Ray?
Failed at my ventilate.
Ray Cantor, NJBIA. I may be jumping ahead, but I thought when you were running through some of the slides before, you had mentioned risk and cost factors. What does that refer to?
So in terms of risk is what are the impacts associated from climate change pollutants? Everything from changes in climate, sea level rise, increased intensity and frequency of storms. Those are the risk factors associated. So the risk of not regulating greenhouse gas emissions. And the cost factors are one, but not the only factor that we do in every rulemaking that we do, where we look at the associated costs and benefits associated with developing regulations. All right. So we've already gotten into a really good discussion, but at this point, I think I want to ask if Tanya wouldn't mind running us through our ground rules. But by the way, everybody's been really great so far. So if we could all keep it going and keep contributing. So we really appreciate that. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Tanya. I work in the communications office at DEP. I recognize many of you from our stakeholder meetings, and I think we should get bunk beds for those of you who have been here several times in the last month. It's good to see you all again, and I know you could tell, probably many of you could tell explain the ground rules to everybody. If you could just make sure your cell phones are turned off or to vibrate. If you need to take a call, the way the traffic flows in this public hearing room is that you go out those back exit doors. When you need to re-enter the room, you can't come in those doors. You need to come in the side door through that small outer room when you came in this morning. If you need to take a call, please do so in the lobby or the cafeteria. We have offices just across the hall, and you really don't have privacy. Restrooms are located out these doors. Make a left. They're right across the hall. We have a robust agenda, as you already have seen. Several strategies to cover, and you saw how the day has been laid out. Therefore, just know now that we will not take a mid-morning or a mid-afternoon break. Frank mentioned 1 hour lunch. It's kind of floating right now. We're going to look for a natural break somewhere midday to take that lunch break. Part of my role is to keep the group on task in terms of sticking to the timeframes in the agenda. My fear is that we end at 3:30 and we still haven't covered anything, and there's something you wanted to provide comment on that we didn't get to. So really how we're going to do today is allow equal amount of time for all of the strategies. And then, as Frank mentioned, this is kind of the beginning of the discussions. There will be continued discussions. You haven't missed the boat in terms of explaining or sharing a concern or telling us your thoughts about something. Each strategy is going to be introduced by Frank. And so part of my role is to keep us on task in terms of time. Each strategy is going to be introduced by Frank or any other department staff. When their remarks are completed, we're going to open it up for questions for clarity. If we cover something that doesn't make sense to you guys, like this morning already, there were some good questions about what was already covered. And then if you have any concerns with what we're sharing, or if you have suggestions, solutions, that's what we're looking for in terms of input. I'll select you by raised hands. Christine and I'll be passing around the mics. I need to reiterate that we are being Skyped today, so that everything said in the room today is public record, just so you're aware of that, and that we need the microphones so that anyone who's Skyping can hear what you're saying and hear what we're saying. So I'll select you by raised hands. If you can always begin your comments by your name and who you represent, that's helpful for record keeping and for our listeners. You'll have about 1 minute to share. And so far, you guys have been good about that. I really don't like cutting people off, but I'm just looking for brevity from everybody because we have such a big group. In order to cover everything, we may need to wrap up a discussion on a type of strategy, and there's still maybe 4 or 5 hands up. So what I'd like you to do is write down your thoughts. The slides are numbered. We have time at the end of the day, and so far, we've always been able to get everyone to get those questions out or those comments out before you leave today. Brevity is key for our department reps who are speaking, as well as all of our guests. Our goal is to listen to your input. Our goal is to have all of you listen. We have a lot of diversity of input, of perspectives in the room today. So part of the reasons for a stakeholder meeting like this is to have everybody hear how complicated everything is, possibly have light bulbs go off. Wow, I didn't think about that, or how it would affect that sector, that type of constituent, and so on. We do expect and welcome concerns, problems to be identified along with solutions and suggestions. Today's agenda does not allow time for debates. We're not going to have it. We discourage sidebar discussions, long stories, or any personal grievances, and I will need to halt them if that happens. We have staff in the room who are taking notes. Also, like I said, the Skype itself is recording everything all of our activity today. Please feel free to take your own notes. We will be posting the slides from today on the stakeholder website after this meeting is over, so you will be able to retrieve them. There are questions embedded in the slides that I encourage you to send us your answers to if they don't get covered today. It may require some more time on your part, but that way you'll be able to send us more thorough responses than the time allotted today. Your participation is extremely valuable to us. Thank you for making the trip to Trenton today. Does anyone have any questions just about the proceedings that will be following? Okay, thanks.
We're 9 minutes ahead of schedule. Kind of thought we'd be a little bit longer. Okay, so we're going to go into the more structured part of the presentation now. One of the things that we're asking everyone here today and those who are listening in, again, those online, you cannot submit your questions electronically live, but we encourage you, for those of you who are Skyping in, to submit those comments to us via email, and we'll have an email address at the end of the presentation, which also will be posted for you to provide comments. The regulations that we're considering should consider those emission reductions that can be achieved in the short term as well as the long term to foster alternatives to fossil fuel. And again, there's no hard and fast definition of short term versus long term. I've been doing this long enough to know that there are a school of thought that the department is going too slow. There's a thought and a group that says the department is going too fast. Again, that's one of those things that we want you all to consider when you're making your comments to us. Is this a strategy that should be done on a given timetable? Is this a strategy that can be done, but additional time is needed to do it? But everything that we're looking for here is we're looking to foster alternatives to fossil fuels in the sectors that we regulate. And that's the overarching take home. I want to make sure everybody is taking that home. So long-term versus short-term is arbitrary, but when you make your comments to us, let me know, let us know. What are you thinking in terms of time frame? All right. So, diving right into it. When we're looking at potential strategies short-term for reducing CO2 emissions, I'm just going to talk about these three up front. Switching fuels from a high carbon intensity to a low carbon intensity. What do I mean by that? Well, if you burn a fuel and it produces a lot of CO2, for example, coal is very carbon intense. Is there the ability to switch from a high carbon intensity to a low carbon intensity? That's one strategy. Another shorter term strategy that is available is increasing efficiencies. And again, in the EGU world, it's fairly simple for those of us engineers to say, well, we need to increase the efficiency. So instead of burning fuel in a utility, burn a fossil fuel in a combined cycle. So that is an increase in efficiency. We can put out less pollution for every unit of energy that is produced. That's what we mean by increasing efficiency. The other strategies that should be considered are there ways to reduce the demand of the energy in the first place? Again, this is an efficiency, but is there a way to reduce the overall need for the energy being produced? And the other measure, and again, I'm mentioning this here, not necessarily for this rulemaking, but keep in mind, is there a way to implement transportation control measures? Is there a way to reduce emissions from transportation control measures? That's short-term measures that we've considered, not the only ones, and we'll be discussing that. Now, speaking to potential longer-term strategies, and again, not predefining what we mean by long-term, but something that should be the overarching goal going forward for 2050, electrification. So as Bob mentioned before, and the Energy Master Plan mentions, electrification instead of fossil fuels is a strategy that will reduce CO2 emissions. How we get the electricity generated should be through renewable sources, those that don't contribute greenhouse gases. And I have to mention the third one, carbon capture and sequestration. Again, the department has not taken a position on the feasibility or timing of this, but this certainly should be a consideration. In addition to the renewables and the electrification, is there a way to use carbon capture and sequestration as part of our long-term strategies? So that's sort of the overview of potential strategies. What I want to talk about, and what we're in now in the agenda, is we want to talk very specifically in this segment of our stakeholder on short-term measures for electric generating units. Fuel switching, increasing efficiencies, and soliciting other potential strategies. So, Dave, you asked me the question before. What are the sources we're talking about percentage-wise increasing or contributing to the overall inventory? EGUs are 18% of the CO2 emissions that are coming or that are being produced by the state. So if we're talking short-term, we looked at what are other states doing. There are 2 states in particular that have developed or are developing reductions in CO2 emissions. New York State, for their electric generating units, put an emission standard in place on their electric generating units. So they have a limit of 1,800 pounds of megawatt hour gross electric output, or 180 pounds of carbon dioxide for every million BTU combusted in an input basis for a non-modified existing major electric generating unit. There's a copy of in the presentation that'll be online if you want to look at New York's rule. What is New York's rule? New York's rule is a carbon intensity rule on electric generating units. Now, Massachusetts has implemented a program, an allowance trading program, that's in addition to RGGI. It's a state-only program that looks at annual declining limits on aggregate CO2 emissions. And again, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details, but if you're interested in that, this is what Massachusetts has done. So these are 2 examples of rules that are currently out there for reducing CO2 emissions, Massachusetts and New York. And again, these addresses, if you want to take a picture of them real quick, I'll leave it up for a second, but it will be part of the presentation that we're going to put on the stakeholder webpage. So you'll be able to get that. Now, I talked about carbon intensity. On a heat input, so the amount of fuel, the amount of carbon dioxide per unit of energy on fuels, I have a list up here. And it runs from the highest, most carbon intense fuel of coal, which is about 210 pounds per million BTU. By way of reference, and I'm just going to jump back a slide, if you look at New York's input standard, they put an input standard of 180. So if we looked at that, New York's rule effectively requires no coal units in the state of New York. There are other fuels that are very carbon intense, going from residual oils, those are your bunker C, your heavier fuels, number 4, down to your diesels and kerosenes, and number 2, which are about 160, gasoline 157, propane 139, and natural gas being the lowest fossil fuel at 117 pounds per BTU. So again, one potential strategy is looking at limiting the CO2 per million BTU from EGUs. So again, I'm just going to say this is all still background before we get to discussion. If we look at the electric generating units in the state of New Jersey, and this is a pounds of CO2 per million BTU. If you look at it, I'm an engineer, I'm going to walk and talk you. So, on the left side are the most carbon intense EGUs in the state, and then you get into what obviously is much lower carbon intensity. All of these units are natural gas. These units over here are probably a mixture of gas and oil, and these units over here are coal. And actually, just so everyone knows what the color coding is, The gray is a utility boiler, so it's a traditional boiler that uses a steam generator. The orange are simple cycle turbines, just a turbine. And the blue represents a combined cycle, which is a turbine that is paired with a heat recovery unit to generate additional efficiency and electricity. So this is based on heat input, New Jersey sources. That's not the only way of doing a regulation for EGUs. If we looked at that same source categories based on electricity output, pounds of CO2 for megawatt hour produced, you'll see a similar chart, but something different emerges. If you notice, you actually have some higher emitting peaking units, units that don't operate a lot, that have very high emissions on CO2 per unit of output. You still have your coal units being high because they have a very carbon-intense fuel going through. But notice, once you get over here, these are your combined cycle high-efficiency units that use the lowest fossil fuel-intense carbon. So again, it's two different ways of looking at EGUs in terms of emissions. And they were just characterizing the existing emissions of the sources. So that is heat input based. This is output based. So I just wanted you to see those two slides. All right. So what are some of the permits that the department has issued? And again, the department for major sources, especially new EGUs, has issued emission limits on these existing sources. All of the existing limits in New Jersey for sources that were newly constructed were based on output-based limits. And they range from about 950 down to about 860. So, again, I'm going to go back a chart. The newest units that the department has permitted are right about here, going over here. So, from historically, the emissions that we permit go lower and lower and lower on the output-based standard. All right. Well, is fuel switching available to sources out there? The considerations obviously are the time frame and technology, the cost, health impacts. From an air quality health impact, the health impacts associated with a coal or a heavier oil is much more significant than a natural gas unit. There should be considerations on the location, both the communities that these sources are located in and the availability and suitability of infrastructure. So location is critical when considering fuel switching. The other consideration, would a performance standard or an allowance program make more sense or be easier to implement or should be considered? Keep in mind, time frame, technology, costs, all of those factors, where it's located, need to be taken into account in developing regulations. Now, we're going to get into framing questions in a minute, but I want to give everyone an opportunity to ask any questions about the content of the slides we just ran through. So we're going to do, before we get to the framing questions for discussion, we're going to say, were there questions on the content?
Kim Scarborough, PSEG. One of the things, the last slide that you had, the things that you should consider, also talk about leakage. Anything that you do to impact the performance of the facilities here in the state, because we are in a multi-state market, you may see increased leakage from other PJM states.
Kim, so in the context that Kim, you're making a comment on is leakage as a term from electric dispatch. In other words, if we reduce the amount generated in state, potentially that would have to be made up in another state or another part of PJM that may have higher CO2 emissions?
Either similar or higher. So
similar or
you're
higher.
not seeing any impact at all.
Jeff Tittle, did you look at Washington State's program too? Do they have a program where by 2030 they have to be net neutral for electrical generation?
I think that's in there, but I don't know if they have specific regulations, Jeff. But if they do, if
Yeah,
they have
they do.
specific regulations requiring emission reductions or standards, if you could share those with us, we would be happy.
And the other part too, it's not just the fuel, it's also the technology, using, going from, back to layer, as an example, which is in the Washington State program.
Okay, thank you.
Ray Cantor, New Jersey Business and Industry Association. One, just to confirm, there are no coal, speaking about EGUs, coal has been eliminated as a fuel source.
There's actually 2 facilities with 3 units down in South Jersey that currently burn coal.
From an EGU perspective? Or,
From EGU.
but, okay.
Actually, the only coal in the state is from EGU.
But it's relatively minor, from that perspective. Peakers, again, have been cleaned up substantially, but again, just looking at the total amount of carbon, I assume, it's not that high either. And you could correct me if I'm wrong. But a larger comment, unlike maybe manufacturing, where maybe you don't need the product that's being generated, and we can argue whether or not it makes economic sense to have it or not. Electric generation is a necessary, function in New Jersey. And if you look at the EMP itself, it is anticipating a need to double the amount of electricity generated, and I think that actually may even be on the low side, based on all the assumptions that they're making. They also then assume a 7,500 megawatts of wind being developed. They're looking at a significant increase in in-state solar, which may or may not be feasible. They're looking for our nuclear plants to remain operational to 2050, if not longer, which may or may not be feasible. And they're looking for a substantial amount of clean energy coming from, out of state being transported into in-state. So the point, again, I said all that, but I could have just said leakage as well. You cannot just look to reduce in-state generation of electricity without looking where those additional sources are going to be coming from. It's self-defeating if you do that. And again, the EMP looks for a longer horizon for all those other sources to be put into place, as opposed to short-term, horizons. So anything you reduce here is going to be coming from somewhere else. And as you know, if it's coming from the rest of PJM, it's probably much likely at a higher carbon intensity.
Okay, thanks, Ray. We have 2 people lined up who had their hands up. We're just looking for clarity on what was just shared before we start asking everybody questions. Christine, wait, Bill had his hand up earlier. Bill, do you still have a question? Okay.
I don't know if it's a question or a thought. I'm Bill O'Sullivan, retired regulator, so this is my thing, regulation. On the considerations, you ought to look at the tons per year also, because those peakers, those old peakers, they may only be used a couple % a year, and to expend a lot of resources, focus on regulation of something that only gives you a little bit, it might not be worthwhile. It might be other things you could better spend your time on. And then also you should consider in this thing the remaining useful life. For example, those coal units. Again, you could spend a lot of time regulating those 2 coal units, but if they're going to shut down in a few years, or even 10 years, which is within the short-term horizons considering 2050, is it worth your while to go after those coal units that produce less than 1% of that 18%?
Okay, we have a question or comment back here with Eric, and then, ma'am, we see you'll be next.
Eric DeJezero. Frank, on that slide, and granted I'm way out of my league here in terms of EGUs, but on the slide that you showed in terms of heat output, the 3 peaking units, those are to the left. And relative to, the Energy Master Plan states that we're moving to winter peaking long term because we're going to be electrifying everything. And when my heat pump doesn't keep me warm enough, I get more electric heat is the Energy Master Plan's answer as my backup, unlike other states that allow fossil fuels. So what is the departments going forward, knowing that we're going to winter peaking, yet showing the issue here? What, from a reliability perspective, is that factored in to the department's thinking about what you might be doing relative to peaking units when we're going to need more electric heat, and then when my electric heat doesn't work, more electric heat?
So I'll turn back to you, Eric. Is your comment to us that the department, again, should take into account reliability and making sure that there's adequate electricity? I'm hearing this comment. So again, I want a dialogue here. I don't necessarily want to have to answer all the questions, but if you could pose it to us for consideration. So if you're posing to us for consideration that we should consider reliability, that we should consider leakage, that we consider the overall shift to electrification in a lot of our strategies for long term.
Good point. Go ahead.
Nancy Griffith, Unitarian Universalist Faith Action. Could you expand on how the environmental justice community concerns play into the choice of a performance standard?
Well, again, I guess in terms of just the location of the sources that are emitting, there are other pollutants associated with electric generation units. So in terms of permitting new or modifications to existing sources or impacts from existing sources, that the air quality impacts that are not necessarily greenhouse gas emissions come into play for those sources, or excuse me, for those communities that are hosting those electric generating units. So that's the consideration generally.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Elizabeth Stein, Environmental Defense Fund. I just have a clarifying question about a term that wasn't familiar to me. Back on the slide about short-term strategies, 3A was, I believe, transportation control measures, and I couldn't think through what that meant in the context of these kinds of resources.
So in the context, so you're speaking of slide 14, implementing transportation control measures. One of the things, and I'm just going to flip ahead, one of the things that Massachusetts program has built in is the ability to generate credits. Massachusetts program has the ability to generate CO2 emission offsets from transportation control measures. So in terms of consideration, and I pointed everybody to the Massachusetts role, is Massachusetts allows you to do electrification or reduction transportation control measures that reduce CO2 emissions, bank those emissions, and then use them in their allowance program. So that's what we mean by that. Used in the stationary source side, correct.
Okay, I'm going to the back of the room here. Walking. There you go,
Matt Polsky. First, I thought this was a little outside of this context, but I saw the connection. You're talking about efficiency, and my first thought was some frustration because over the years I've thought we've underplayed it and haven't really thought that comprehensively about how to do it well. I noticed that BPU hired the Rocky Mountain Institute for a project, and their leader actually is a legend when it comes to efficiency. And I'm wondering whether we have seriously thought about what we can do efficiency at the end use for appliances and homes and so forth. And the connection is that possibly that could be linked with where you're going here, as part of what these generators have to do is to manage efficiency programs at the end use and with appliances. And if we were to do that, some of the elements that have not been part of this are some really serious discussion about communication, education, and behavioral science, which really have a lot of potential.
Thank you.
This is Bill O'Sullivan again. I spoke before about the peakers that have the high carbon intensity. I don't want to leave the impression that they should be ignored because they're not used much now. And I think something Eric said drove that home, is as we go forward and we're producing more electricity, there may be those old peakers that are used a little bit now are used more. And if, you know, if go back to the, if you, Frank, could you put up the peaker slide? There. are where those 4 peakers on that side, well over 2,000. And you see there that nowadays a new peaker can be about 1,000. So there's an opportunity to, perhaps over a decade, to phase out those high emitting peakers before they're used more to supply more electricity.
Thank you. Ray, ahead.
And only because you said you wanted to get the statements out there publicly, yes, reliability needs to be considered, and yes, cost needs to be considered as well. Cost not just to the EGU, to that facility, but cost to the ratepayer, as well.
Thank you. Good comments.
So really good comments. Now we're going to get to the focused question section for short-term strategies for EGU emissions. All right. So now we want to start the discussion, and I'm going to run through the 7 questions that we want to hear some very specific input. 1, what option would the facility or constituency you represent most likely choose? 2, what are the advantages and disadvantages that you feel for each option? 3, what are the best options? What options are best for the environment? 4, how do you think that each option affects public health? 5, what is the effect on environmentally burdened areas? 6, what is the social impact of each option, with a sub-question, jobs, question mark? And what is the impact of each option outside of New Jersey? So these are the questions we'd like to spend maybe the next half hour or so going through. So again, we're focusing in on, if everyone's not sure, I'm just going to go back and I'm going to come right back to these questions. Fuel switching, increasing efficiencies, and potentially any other strategies that we'd like to discuss. So this is for EGUs. All right. Who would like to start us off? Kim. Thank you, Kim.
Kim Scarborough, PSEG. I think when we look at EGUs, obviously we have the RGGI program that we just started in January 1st. The BPU is currently doing some modeling to look at the leakage impacts. Also, PJM is looking at how to alleviate some of the leakage with the RGGI and non-RGGI states. I think waiting to see the results of that, anything else that adds a price to our units may cause or exacerbate the leakage issue. And I really would like for the department to work with both PJM as well as the BPU to understand the leakage issue as you move forward.
Jeff Tittle, I think there's some other options that should be here. First and foremost, there are 4 power plants that are being proposed now, so if they do get built, then there goes your models and your reductions, and so that's a real concern. Second, I think that there are technological upgrades to many of the facilities that could actually help lower the carbon per megawatt, because there are plants now that can come in at about 600 pounds. It's the highest available technology out there. 700 is also is easier to be done. So there are, and then the third piece is to phase out those older, dirtier pieces. That's not part of it. I think that's a key piece too. Not only the peakers, but some of the other plants. And Bill, we shouldn't wait 10 years to get rid of dirty plants, especially since they have, many of them have, are in overburdened communities, and when they do run, and they are some of the biggest sources. I'll have some more later, but those are my 3 points.
Elizabeth Stein, Environmental Defense Fund. I just wanted to mention something that wasn't, I guess it's the any other strategies, neither fuel switching nor efficiencies.
which is flexibility resources that reduce the need for peakers and/or generally less efficient resources, including things like storage, both battery and also of various thermal types, other kinds of demand response, and price signals that communicate when the dirtiest, most expensive generating units are online and give both wholesale buyers and even end consumers a reason to not buy the most costly, dirtiest power.
Gerald Foley, DOE's CHP Technical Assistance Program. So I just want to address combined heat and power. All that we've spoken about thus far are sort of the large centralized plants. I assume that there's room here in the thinking for combined heat and power, which would meet those low, sub 1,000 pound, particularly on an output basis. So I guess that's a question. Is there room for CHP?
We are going to talk about non-electric generating use, the traditional plants. We are going to talk about industrial institutional opportunities. And I think that's definitely going to be an opportunity to discuss combined heat and power. So basically, we're talking about generation that is going onto the grid. I think you're primarily talking about on-site use of electricity and heat?
Yes, I mean, it's going to be both as we move forward, as we get into more transactional, and CHP provides that kind of local output system that can help the grid in terms of needs. So yes, you could split it. It is an electric generating unit primarily. And, to that, so we can shelve it other than to say that output-based standard that takes into account all outputs. So for CHP specifically, thermal is, critical to recognizing that. Thank you.
Understood.
We're coming. Hi, I'm Barb Blumenthal from New Jersey Conservation Foundation. I wanted to say something about belts and suspenders, and I'm not sure if what we've been talking about are the belts or the suspenders, but let's say they're the belts, which is some kind of regulation that could be mass-based to set, like Massachusetts has done, to force down total aggregate emissions from electric generators on a declining, predictable schedule. And we know that that would work. We can do that. You have the legal authority to do that. We also know that it completely doesn't address climate change because those emissions without other measures end up someplace else. So that's the fundamental dilemma. So the other strategy, I think we need two, and I think of the second strategy as actually being the primary one, is deploying a mix of clean energy resources that are actually equivalent to a gas plant. So it isn't just solar and wind, as Elizabeth said, it's also flexibility resources. The IEP was designed to illuminate that issue. What is the combination of resources that actually can replace in a reliable, low-cost way? So we have to stop thinking it's not just solar and wind, it's solar, wind, short-term flexibility, and longer-term firm resources that are clean. And if we can deploy those in combination, they will replace in the marketplace the fossil fuel generation that we're trying to replace. And then you can combine it with regulating within the state to assure that that happens. But the mechanism that really is driving it is this market mechanism of deploying the right mix of resources that replace fossil fuels without leakage. So that's the key. So if you only did the suspenders without the belts, you end up with massive leakage. So I just want to highlight that there's two complementary strategies here.
Thank you.
Talking about the Bill O'Sullivan, talking about efficiency, and in your toolbox, the air program's toolbox today, there is a requirement for advances in the art of air pollution control for the larger sources. And your chart, Frank, shows that you are applying this to the new sources as the newest sources have the lowest emissions. And I would recommend that you take a careful look at your advances in the art of air pollution control authorities and perhaps make more emphasis on efficiency and lower and better efficiencies for the smaller units. You do it for the big ones. And so you should look at what are the thresholds and should they be lowered? Can you do it regulatorily, or do you need some legislation? And what kind of better efficiencies are reasonable to require in new units? And perhaps there's a role for your general permits here to revise your general permits to require higher efficiency new units for those smaller units. So there's a lot of opportunities for the department to require better efficiencies that people are naturally going towards because of lower costs anyway, but to ensure that we're not getting low efficiency boilers installed new.
So Bill, I worked for you for 15 years, so I can say this. That's a great comment, but it's in the wrong section. We're going to talk about the smaller units next, so I'm going to ask you to remember what you said, re-say it in about 15 to 20 minutes. So I know.
We're being recorded. It's okay.
Does anyone have responses to the questions? We talked about fuel switching, and we have been talking a lot about efficiencies, but there's other strategies that you guys have been suggesting. So we're asking for advantages or disadvantages. Also, the department does have to consider public health, environmental justice communities, and impacts on those communities. Does anyone have any thoughts on these short-term strategies, whether it's one that's been suggested from our group or one that was on a slide that DEP has been considering up until this point?
Thank you. This is Brian Ray from the New Jersey Student Sustainability Coalition. I'm going to run the gamut here and touch upon a few points, being that environmental sustainability and environmental justice are some hallmarks of work being done in communities like Newark, for example, where we see compiled resources with respect to non-EGU and EGU sources. But all that to say, considerations for permitting moving forward, whereas you see a lot of CO2 emissions in the area and other such materials, other output sources, I would recommend, for instance, some of the permitting to be comprised of the adjustments being made in firm implementation in the area, or other sources of renewable energy co-occurring, or considering outside factors such as high volumes of transportation, et cetera, and those other demands in the area, how that factors into a EGU facility output in that area, and in the short-term scheme of reductions in their emissions, how considering the implementations of those alternatives to energy co-occurring, whether or not a certain allowance of emissions is warranted for the time being, waiting to see if other resources are being developed on a similar time frame as to what the EGU is looking to implement. So just considering what options there are as far as the materials outside of the EGU and how they can work to reduce their emissions while ensuring energy supply from other sources is also increasing. And additionally, that's a compounded interest for those who are experiencing CO2 emissions health issues in the area. So having proximity to CO2 emissions from other EGU sources in one area, all summed up in how you permit these plants to operate, with consideration for other energy sources or materials being used that are on the renewable side at the same time, how that weighs into who you allow to and at what levels pollute in said area. And just to touch upon the rest, I think, as far as jobs and development in that regard, that helps in communities where pollution has been a long-standing issue with respect to how we're generating electricity non-conventionally anymore, through solar, through other sources. So it would definitely be something to consider economically as far as invigorating economies and communities. But at the same point, while doing all of that work, as far as the public health is concerned, there should be that mechanism in place to assure accountability and sustainability from other sources so that the public health is not affected foremost.
Thank you, Brad.
Go ahead.
Frank, Bob Bissett, SIBO. I did, Bob Bissett, Council of Industrial Boiler Owners, SIBO. Am I missing something? There should be probably 8 instead of 7 questions. What's the impact on the cents per kilowatt hour? There's no point in there for cost. We talk about all the good stuff, which is really good, but there is that other side that does have to be considered. And electricity, 60% of it is used for thermal energy. That's where I'll come in on the industrial side. But that sense of cost becomes really important. And I have a handout I can give out to help people understand that. But cost needs to be added there someplace.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Jeff Tittle. Looking at the list of plants and that, there are 2 things that popped up, and also looking at New York and Washington, they've attached their decarbonization or reducing carbon in the electrical generating section by also accelerating and expanding their goals towards renewable energy. New York State has set a target of 100% renewable by 2040, and I believe Washington State is similar. So that's part of it, and I guess the question I have, and then I have a second one, is how does this program match up with our movement towards renewable energy, whether it's offshore wind and solar, and does that have an impact on the number of plants? And then the second is, when I looked at the list, a lot of those plants are also selling power to New York that we're not even seeing it. Some of the cleanest plants in New Jersey, like C. Warren 7 and CPV and the big cogen, the old El Paso cogen plant, are all going to New York. So so we're saying, well, they're cleaner, but they're actually not cleaner because we're not using that power here.
So the standard is on the amount produced in state, and we went into this discussion a little bit on Friday. But for clarity's sake, when we're regulating the source, we're regulating the source that's in New Jersey pursuant to a standard, and the output-based standard is just one potential standard. It happens to be a really easy way, and that's why we've done it in permitting for new sources to look at CO2 per output. And the output here is easily measured electricity. And it does take into account the efficiencies, which is, again, I think we're going to say this again and again and again, efficiency tends to be one of the cheapest ways to do these regulations in the short term. To increase efficiency so if you can produce the same for less emissions, that is a strategy.
Okay, right now, I don't see any hands up.
We got one more.
Oh, okay, there we go.
Lisa Fleming, Vineland Municipal Electric. The questions that are up there I have to say, I haven't read the Energy Master Plan yet. This is all new to me a couple weeks ago. But they seem to be questions that are for down the road rather than trying to formulate a basic plan. And I think one thing that's missing in my mind, I mean, you say, what option would we choose? It's like, the first one that comes to mind is we'll just go out of business. We just won't run. And the thing that's missing here is that I'm not sure who has an ultimate obligation to be providing power. Like, we all know power is regulated and we have a system and it's working, but is there a law that says you will produce power and we're going to figure out how you can do it better and better and better so that it's cleaner and cleaner and cleaner? It's like, I don't know that we would keep going. We already, for those who don't know, we used to burn coal and oil. Now we have 2 gas turbines peaking. They're new, they're efficient. Each of them is 64 megawatts. And one of the 3 big ones on the side, the peaking units, is ours too. It's a very small turbine. Yes, it has high emissions, but as Bill pointed out, it hardly ever runs. It runs less than 100 hours a year, hottest day, coldest day. It's just there for the edge. We don't have any incentive to run it anymore. It might be the case that if things started changing, and as Bill pointed out, we might have to run them more and more, we probably wouldn't do that. It would probably just, it's old, it's from the 70s, it would just shut down. And I am totally in support of this movement. I truly would like to be part of something that gets us to putting a lid on climate change. But personally, I think it has to come from a different place. We just have to stop using so much power. I mean, the demand side is where everything is to me, and we can't force that. There is an opportunity perhaps for us as a municipality to do something within the city to help people reduce their energy consumption. We can perhaps do some things with energy storage, some other innovative things, but there's still things around the edges.
Those were great points. And again, this is there will be more discussion and more time you raised some good questions, and people here may be having answers to your questions that you raised, or some feedback and thoughts, and we can build on each other's thoughts if we want to. Okay.
Brian Ray, NJ Student Sustainability Coalition. Some follow-ups to the points I mentioned earlier, and with respect to Reggie, for instance, that we're re-entering. Now, we know in instances, as we've seen through other forms of reduction programs out there, that sometimes the emissions, while taken away from one area, will be offset by being produced in an overage in another area, further burdening environmental justice communities, for instance. So I would look at how in your permitting process you preserve the health of individuals from those potential overages and, peak demand times, et cetera, and as well as, I'm not so versed in the permitting itself, you account then for older infrastructure and those demands, all while you're balancing the potential for those overages in particular cities, and all amongst the proposed supplements to energy that are assisting EGUs, such as those renewables in place as well.
One in the back, behind you, Tanya?
There, Tanya, and
Oh,
then
there's one there and one there. Two and two. In red, 1 and 2.
Hi, Judy Minot, New Jersey Sierra Club. I know there's a lot of smarter people than me in the room, but looking at the 2 graphs, I know we established that today's meeting is only talking about CO2 levels because that's what the DEP measures and has the ability to regulate. But when we look at power plant output without considering methane, the concern I have is that we kind of don't talk about the elephant in the room. Now, obviously, we should not be promoting the use of older, inefficient coal plants. But if we continue along this path and use these types of graphs where we're looking at gas plants without considering in the graphic representation the total greenhouse gas output, not just the CO2 output, we have a picture in our mind of these gas plants as being, I can't say more beneficial, but less harmful. Yet we know that the issues of outside New Jersey where the generation of the gases comes from fracking, so that's number 7. And we also know that there's there are the methane problem, and as well as the leakage, which, as you say, they're not regulated and not measured as far as I know. So I just want to put that out there, that this is just a dangerous, understanding the ground rules, but still, if we go forward without that consideration, it just seems very sideways, perhaps giving us the wrong impression.
Understood.
Hi, I also wanted
Thank
to
you.
talk about, Sue Dorward. I'm concerned, I see the short term, you're saying fuel switching to natural gas and cogen to get more efficiency. And short term for reductions, that's great, but does that really dovetail into long term and where we want to be going overall with even lower emissions? And does the short-term goal encourage the creation of natural gas plants that would ultimately become stranded down the road? And where do you adjust your goal?
So I heard questions, but I'm going to try to pull some stuff out of you. What I heard you say is that the development of new gas plants, so in other words, laudable as it is to reduce carbon emissions from existing sources, and again, this is a concern that was expressed by Sierra Club, it's laudable to reduce existing sources, but the concern is, from different levels, the development of new gas electric units is of concern from upstream impacts, total life cycle, and also the potential that it would be a stranded asset. You spend the money to develop it, and then if your ultimate goal in 30 years is to not have that unit, you haven't fully utilized that resource. So is that a fair?
Ray Cantor, NJBIA. I think a lot of the comments you're hearing from all sides of the room, are demonstrating that the issues involved in, I'll just speak just to EGUs, are far more complex and far broader than just the limited purview that this rule and the AIR program is, empowered to undertake. And obviously, there needs to be lots of different solutions in lots of different sectors, over time in order to get to where we want. We personally think, by the way, just from a electric generation perspective, that there needs to be a good amount of firm capacity, be it nuclear or be it, natural gas. And, at this moment, we're at least not convinced that, at least the EMP has not discussed the nuclear issue other than just, its assumption that it will be there. And I think it would be fairly not responsible to just eliminate natural gas until we understand where our firm capacity is going to come from at a certain point. But, I should have asked this question earlier. You're going through an awful lot of permutations here to reduce, through the permitting program, emissions from EGUs. Can you explain why RGGI is not enough to get you there, or why that paradigm does not get you there, or where you need to go?
So, Bob, I'm going to look to you for just a second. But in terms of the RGGI program, there are planned program reductions in RGGI for total emissions over the next 10-year period, and they amount to how many? So by 2030, 20%, 30% reduction. So the 30% reduction will get you emission reductions, but clearly, and I'm not sure about the business as usual, but I think the business as usual case that we posted very early in the presentation, I'm not sure if that includes RGGI or not, but it would not be sufficient to get 80% reduction, or RGGI will not get us to 100% renewable energy by 2050.
Again, 2030 to 2050 is still a 20-year, gap in a period of time. There may, within 20 years, there may be different technologies and different ways, of acting. So, again, and it all depends if you're looking at long-term versus short-term. So, again, there's a lot to be taken into account here. And, again, our concern is that we don't make precipitous decisions now that may be costly and not really productive, based on assumptions 2050. And I'll just say this one additional thing, because someone mentioned Rocky Mountain Institute, earlier, and they were, obviously did the IEP for the EMP. On one of their webinars, I think it was toward the end, they said that their projections, to 2050 over that period are highly speculative and not should be relied upon. That they're only looking to make projections that could influence decisions in the next 2 to 3 years. So again, I would caution the department not to rely too much on those assumptions in that plan and to take things slowly and cautiously.
Okay, thank you.
Jeff and Bill.
Matt, go ahead.
Yeah. A perspective, I mean, I'm very happy that we're asking these hard questions, because it wasn't that many years ago I was in this room, last administration, nominally talking about climate change to the Science Advisory Board, and nobody mentioned the Global Responsibility Act at all, as if it didn't even exist until I did at the end. But we can't wait so many years to get this, and I'm glad that we're on our way now. But in that frame, there's another lurking issue that may be as difficult to address as climate change. It's biodiversity. And the latest tracking is that we're projected to lose 1 million species. And this will impact us in all sorts of ways, to say nothing about our ethical responsibilities. So I'm very happy that I'm seeing certain things profiled there that all should be up there. I'm not against putting economics on there. That should be there too. But what about the critters? So since this is short term, I would say DEP, if it's not already doing it, AIR, should be talking to the natural resources side of the house and making sure we're thinking creatively about how to protect the critters and the endangered species in this state. And again, if it's economics, it's not perfect, but you can put an economic value to ecological services.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. I know we have 2 more up here, and we're going to wrap up this section real soon. But there's a lot of people in the room who haven't provided any comment yet, and I urge you to put your hands up. I mean, speak now before the train moves on. We've had a lot of people sharing several comments, and I'd rather like to hear from folks we haven't heard from yet. So don't hold back. Is there anybody? First timer? Yeah, good.
Hi, Sharon Brown from Ethos Energy Group. I wanted to just point out that there are compliance mandated compliance items that are included in certain permits, and to meet the mandates of your Title V, in some cases, you're running when you normally would not, to basically affect compliance testing. For example, at the facility that I represent, we basically don't operate on the less clean fuel the majority of the time, but we have a mandate in our Title V to do substantial amounts of compliance testing. So in essence, we run on the less clean fuel more doing the compliance test than we actually do during the course of normal operation. I'd like to have you guys kind of give me a little feedback on how we can address that to demonstrate compliance with your permit, but also to mitigate the effects on the environment with compliance testing.
So Sharon, your issue is when a source has, say, 2 fuels that they're allowed to operate on, and they have a requirement to perform source testing to assure compliance with both of those operating scenarios. The concern you have is they're only using primarily one of the fuel, let's say the cleaner of the two fuels. But they have to turn on in order to demonstrate periodically that they can comply with the emission limits on the dirtier fuel. Right. So again, one of the things that we have looked at in terms of, and I'm getting into the arcane permitting realm, so forgive me, I'm just going to try to address Sharon's concern. But, you know, one of the things that we look at is, how is a permit structured? If the permit is structured that at any time they can burn either fuel, the department wants to have assurances that they can comply with the emission standards with either fuel. Now, we have made exceptions in our rules for oxides of nitrogen, where if the fuel is only used as an emergency, in other words, you've lost the natural gas, there isn't as much monitoring, and in general, I don't even know if they have to stack test when it's an emergency fuel. But from a standpoint of being protective of the environment, if the facility wants the flexibility to operate at any time on the dirtier fuel, the department still requires the ability to determine compliance. Now, perhaps, and we've had discussions in the past, perhaps, if you're not going to use fuel in that year, perhaps you don't have to test in that year. But if you are going to test, if you are going to operate on that fuel, you have to have a current test. So there's a bit of a catch-22 that the department definitely would be willing to consider to avoid using that dirtier fuel. We're not intending sources to start up on a dirtier fuel just for the sake of a stack test. The concern is if a source does not stack test and then operates and we find that they're in non-compliance on that dirtier fuel, that's a liability on the facility, and that's an impact on the community.
That's okay.
I didn't want to just come here with a problem that I want to offer a solution. Could we consider, I know that the state has delegated authority from EPA, so you don't have total autonomy to define permit conditions, but maybe there's a way to essentially address this by, for example, taking some of that RGGI monies that are going to be coming in and beefing up our stack testing group here at BTS, it used to be called, now it's emissions measurement. So basically to have almost like, if we have a natural gas curtailment and facilities can't run on natural gas because homeowners are given a priority in a very, very tough temperature, like the bombogenesis, for example. What about having almost like a rapid response stack testing situation where the state can dispatch emissions measurement group using some of those funds, beef up our own internal tools from a regulatory standpoint, and have them come out to do stack testing, not at the, I mean, maybe the facility could actually augment that cost, but something like that, or pay, but have the ability, like right now, before we do a stack test, we have to let you guys know months and ahead of time, we have to have a protocol approved, there are all kinds of things. What if we could do something, and I think that people who are advocates for the environment would get with this too, because now you're getting real-time data. You're also addressing whether or not we're complying with our permit. Okay, and I'm going to wrap this up, but but that's just something to consider. There's so many, your groups do amazing things when they come out to watch a stack test. Beef them up, let them come out and do it. The good players aren't afraid of compliance testing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Toby Hanna from ERM. Frank, I think my primary comments on this section are, one, we just went back into RGGI, let's use that. It looks at total mass emissions, it looks at tons, which is what drives the climate effect. It's market-based mechanism, which allows it to get at all of the different facets that are occurring unit by unit, the differences between units. And my second comment is to echo Bill O'Sullivan, it really is about the tons emissions. When you look at intensities, whether it's input or output based, that's not necessarily what's driving global warming or greenhouse gas impact. It's the tons. Again, back to Reggie, it does that. It's designed for that.
Sure. Hi, this is Adam Beam from the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. For those who may not know, that's the Metropolitan Planning Organization for Greater Philadelphia, so it may come as no surprise that I'm most interested in the transportation component that you mentioned, which was the transportation control measures and their implementation, I guess allowing perhaps more emissions from those point sources, like has been done in Massachusetts. And I think that's a really important point to consider because, you know, as the fleets electrify, there'll be more energy demand, so decreasing that demand through vehicle miles traveled or through public transit options or walking or biking, that's really important for future demand as well as public health and other social impacts.
Thank you. We have time for one more comment, but I'm looking for someone who hasn't. Okay, you have the last word, Jeff.
So no, I just meant that we can't hang our reductions on Reggie. First of all, the number that we have right now from Reggie at 18 million tons was where we were in 2010. So the 30% reduction that we're calling for isn't going to get us anywhere near where we need to be in the electrical sector alone. Also, there's some environmental justice issues and other things with Reggie. But in order for it to work, and if you look, you know, what other states are trying to do is we have to get to the 45% IPCC number if we really want to have a chance at this. And so I think that, you know, Reggie is one of the tools, but it's not going to get us there alone. And the other point too, which is also sort of missing a little bit, is that if we don't get to these reductions, then the costs to society and to the environment are going to be much more astronomical. And that should be part of the mix as well as we look at trying to get to the reductions.
Thank you. So I just want to let everyone know, if you have additional comments on this particular part of the stakeholder meeting, we will be putting up an email address at the end that will also be posted online. If you think of something, if you weren't able to get your thoughts out today, if you want to make additional suggestions, please make those suggestions. So we are 1/4 of the way through the topics we want to discuss today. So I'm going to go right into the next topic, which Bill, I hope you remembered your comments from earlier because it would be appropriate now. So we're talking about now short-term strategies for non-electric generating units. Those 3 strategies, at least for discussion, well, 2 and a probe for more. The first is fuel switching. We've talked about that a little bit. Increasing efficiencies. Does that ring a bell for anybody? Thank you, Bill. And potential other strategies. So here's a familiar slide. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's the same slide as we did with EGUs, looking at different carbon intensities associated with fuels, ranging from solid coal down to natural gas. Dave, I have some slides for you. So the first slide here is a breakdown of approximately how much fuel of each of the types are used in the different sectors, industrial, commercial, and residential, showing you that there are significant amounts of fuel used, but also those fuels, I'll let Dave take a picture, those fuels represent emissions. And so the question was, how much emissions are we speaking about? This is the emissions slide by sector approximately from our 2017 inventory. Keep in mind, this does not include EGUs. This does not include mobile sources. So we're limiting this to stationary, industrial, commercial, and residential by fuel. All right. So that's just background information. Now, what are some of the considerations? Again, this will be a very familiar slide. There's considerations: time frame and technology, cost, health impacts. Where is this facility? Where are these emissions occurring? Are they in an overburdened EJ community? Are they located in an area where fuel switching or efficiencies or one of the strategies that somebody else might propose are not available? And again, just by way of example, the same slide we talked about, what other performance standards would make sense in New Jersey? Keep in mind, New York does not have standards for their non-EGU sector. I believe Massachusetts is sector-wide. It's more than just EGUs. But you have to consider, again, those time frame, cost, and impacts, and location. So before we get to the structured questions, does anybody have any questions about that real brief overview of the non-EGU sector? What are the emissions? What are potential strategies? And again, we've identified 2, but we would solicit additional for consideration.
Just a quick question, I'm sure it's easy to find. What % of carbon emissions are coming from those sources? So we know what universe we're talking about.
So let's see, if it's about 100 million tons of carbon is the total loading. So if you added up those sectors, that's about 28 million. So it's about, all told, it's about 28% of the greenhouse gas total. So it just happens to be we're about 100 million metric tons statewide currently. So you could break it down. You could say it's like 9% industrial, commercial is 6.3, and 14% is currently residential.
Well, hold on, Ray. Christine, can you give him the mic, please?
Just to clarify, that residential is only the large permanent residential, it's not including all residential.
Actually, Ray, this is all residential.
So
this
that-
is statewide based on the amount of fuels sold to each of the sectors.
So fine, so as we progress in this conversation then, it's going to be very useful to understand what % of this universe that you're looking to address.
Ray, that's a great question. It's difficult to answer, but it's going to be some subset of that total residential that is actually permitted.
Eric DeJezero, Fuel Merchants Association. So Ray asked the first of my 2 questions. The second is, this is just CO2 emissions. This is not CO2e emissions for equivalent of CO2. So methane is not taken into account in this slide. This is just from the combustion and the CO2 that results.
You are correct.
Thank you.
Judy Minot, Jersey Sierra Club. And just for the record, the 118 is also not CO2e, correct? It's just CO2. 118 million.
Actually, I think this 100, it's CO2e.
It is CO2e.
Equivalent, yes.
But using a 100-year time horizon, and you need to update all those numbers in light of the law the governor just signed, correct?
Thank you for the comment, yes.
I just want to remind people to say your name and who you represent. I'm sorry to keep doing that, but because of Skype, if we have people coming in and out at different times, for record, we just need to have people know who you are.
Grant Lucking with the builders. Similar question again, are you just looking at existing permits the DEP issues now, or requiring new permits and any change in thresholds to those permits for these?
Our initial thought is to operate within the existing permitting program, but again, that's why we're having this discussion.
Brian Ray again, or just quick housekeeping question. Are these emissions valuations based on fuel sold?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments, just to clarify what's being covered? We have go ahead.
Yes, Klaus Rittenbach, Climate Action New Jersey. What would be the equivalent numbers if you broke it out by heating sources, heating homes, heating industries, just for heating? Do you have those numbers?
I think all of these are potentially, again, with the exclusion of those engines that would be used, I would think these will all be for useful heat. whether it be steam. I'm sorry, answer your question with a question. Are you speaking in terms of space heating versus industrial heat, or are you speaking useful thermal energy generated from these emissions?
Space heating, I believe, keeping the building warm.
Okay, yeah. We do not have that level, I don't think, specificity. Here, Bob.
The commercial and residential is almost entirely all that space heating. The industrial, we don't have that level of breakdown, but that industrial would include the fuel used for process operations as well as thermal energy needed either for process operations or for heating the infrastructure around the facilities.
Any other comments for clarity? Go ahead, Matt.
Matt Polsky, a PhD student these days. Again, I'm going to look at the framing and suggest an alternative way to look at that, which will sound crazy, I think, to most people. But I think if we're going to really solve this problem, I don't know about in our lifetimes, maybe the generation after us, we have to think very differently and take advantage of opportunities that are there, but we might be missing. So I'm looking at this and I'm seeing, the fossil fuel that particularly the industrial and commercial sector are emitting. But I'm also, not so much recently, but a few years ago, spending a lot of time looking at how certain companies in those sectors are evolving their very way they look at this kind of issue. And we're seeing certain amazing things, if you look for it, of companies that are saying, I want to be net zero. I want to be better than net zero. We're seeing the financial sector starting to change in big ways, very complementary to that. So I think it's pretty amazing if we look for that, they're there. So my larger picture proposal is way beyond anything air could do, and this is really at the highest levels, is to re-look at this as an opportunity and think if we could realign the traditional roles of each of our sectors to how we could go towards a green economy and have as one possible goal the greenest industrial economic base in the country. And how can each of us in whatever sector we're in help make that happen?
Thank you. All right.
Thanks, Matt.
If there's no other questions on content, we're going to go back to the framing questions. Again, you've seen these before. Again, keep in mind, it may not say explicitly there about cost, but when I introduced everything, cost is a consideration. It's just not the only consideration. I think it's not on any of these charts because I think it was understood that cost would be, when we mentioned at the beginning, would be considered. But this is where we're looking for everybody's input too. These, again, keeping in mind short-term measures or short-term strategies to reduce emissions from non-EGU sources. So these are the same 7 questions that you saw under the EGUs.
Toby Hanna from ERM. More and more companies are coming out with corporate commitments. What was just mentioned, zero carbon or other aggressive commitments. And those are commitments to their shareholders, to their customers, and to other important stakeholders. So they're pretty enforceable. It'd be nice to be able to accommodate some flexibility to allow for that and the improvements that they've got, many of which are short-term, many of which they're already have taken action on. When we get into looking at performance standards or efficiency standards on individual types of equipment, that may not fit their plans, and it may not blend in with what they're already trying to work toward. So would there be some way to accommodate corporate commitments for reducing their impact and letting them do what they think is best for their organizations within their confines, rather than setting command and control responsibility that might conflict with what their plans are?
So Toby, is your request to consider measurable but voluntary measures that each source could potentially implement as part of a larger greenhouse gas reduction corporate-wide?
Yes, Frank, yes. Allow the flexibility for those types of commitments if they're moving forward, if they're taking action to count.
Right.
Bob Bissett, SIBO. I work with the industrial sector, the larger corporations. These are pretty good guys. And they are doing their best to try to actually reduce carbon and to increase efficiencies. Efficiencies mean money. But the decision-making processes, and most of us need thermal energy, like we need in our homes to boil a cup, make a cup of coffee. Thermal energy is extremely important, and sometimes we don't think of it in terms of how that relates to electrification and the drives that we have to maximize efficiency. I have a piece of paper that I'm going to put out to the front here. There's enough for everybody, but it talks a bit about the cost of electricity and thermal energy. I don't know if anybody realizes, but when you put it in line as far as the cost of what we have to use for our energies, for the thermal energy piece, the things that we do, it becomes a driving force in how those regulations are developed and what we can in reality accomplish at the facility level to maximize the reductions in CO2 greenhouse gases that we are all trying to do and have to show that we're doing. Electricity is the most expensive form for generating thermal energy. It's 29, at 10 cents a kilowatt hour, electricity is $29 per million BTU. Today, industry and people are getting natural gas at $2 per million BTU. When you think about the impact of electrification and the impact of how do you maximize efficiencies at the numbers we have, electricity becomes a very complicating factor. We have to address that. And New Jersey, you guys have done a remarkable job. You already have in place in your regulations for compliance with NOx emissions for small boilers, a means of looking at energy tune-ups. And Bill did that. Tune-ups for compliance. It's amazing. New Jersey has always been a leader, and we thank you. I'll put this out, and it's probably something that you guys might find interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ray Cantor, NJBIA. One, I'd like to second Toby's, comment about flexibility. I think that's a good one. I'll also mention as well, from an industrial process perspective, the cost of electricity and that energy is very significant, to this business competitive, factor. New Jersey has already lost a number of manufacturing plants, over the last several decades, energy being one, key cost. So I would, heat, space heat versus industrial process, energy creation. I think you need to really consider what those costs are going to be. Also, and just to make sure I'm hearing or what I have not heard that you're, at least in the short term, looking to ban carbon-based fuel boilers or other types of devices in any of these sectors. You're not saying no. I haven't heard you say that.
We're one of the strategies, Ray, is switching from more carbon-intense fuels to less carbon-intense fuels. That's number one on the list. So that's for this group.
So just to say in a affirmative sense, are you considering a ban on any new gas-fired boilers or heating devices?
Notice it, Ray, we haven't made any decisions on that. We're taking input as part of this rulemaking.
Brian Ray again. As far as the non-EGU emission sources, I was interested in the permitting process for them, if EGUs could have preference in emissions over non-EGUs in terms of the utility of the EGU. Obviously, if it's the summer and it needs to perform in greater capacities than an EGU, which is less prioritized with respect to its own energy use and its own carbon emissions, if that's something you've considered. Additionally, if you want me to clarify a bit further.
Could you, Brian, clarify that?
Basically, if emissions, an allowance of which through a permit are, less substantial for an EGU, for a non-EGU than an EGU, whereas a source, a facility needs to generate power and the emissions may be higher than a regular building or some site that doesn't produce power or is not as substantial or beneficial to the community, how you then allot allowances for emissions in your permits.
So the first thing is, you're saying instead of an emission standard, we should consider an allocation program? So I'm just going to try to fill in the details. What I think you're saying is that if the department were to do an allocation program similar to Massachusetts, that the allocation of emissions should be prioritized for EGUs over non-EGUs?
Right, and being able to project the needs of EGUs versus non-EGUs when you're permitting their allowance for emissions. This way you can reduce overall emissions, but still have some wiggle room in the case that things are, offset, whereas they do need to produce a bit more during peak periods like the summer, for instance. But some follow-up to that would be in the facilities not able to afford scaling down their emissions with what they have as of yet, whether, if they want to build on-site alternative usage such as solar panels, et cetera, if maybe the DEP could broker some of the establishment of those pieces of technology, whether it's, I don't know, through institutionalized assistance programs, if that's outside of your purview, at least making recommendations for a best track to making those sustainability goals, because a lot of, players in business want to actually make those strides but are ill-informed. And additionally then, as far as going back to the permitting and the allowance of emissions with, prioritization of non-EGU versus EGU, also considering giving an incentive to those who request a lower threshold of emissions right off the bat when asking for permits, and how that would play out as to they're voluntarily going under what is requested of other similar businesses or industries with respect to the emissions they're producing.
Okay. I think I followed it, but I might want to follow up with you offline. But just for clarification, allowance programs versus emission standards. And I didn't spend a lot of time talking about the difference between an allowance program versus an emission standard program. So the easiest way for me to consider or to try to explain is an allowance program is something that is very similar to RGGI, where you use generally a market-based mechanism or an allocation mechanism whereby emissions, sources that emit an air contaminant are required to have a certain amount of allowance. It's not generally stipulated that how many they get. They can be set aside and put into their account, but generally speaking, an allowance-based program works by the state says, this is how many are statewide. And then each source has to go out and purchase the amount equal to what they emit in a given year, which is very different from an emission standards program, which is where we say, for this type of equipment, you cannot emit more than this amount of air contaminant. So what I think you were saying is, on an allowance-based program, to develop an allowance-based program that then gives assistance or set-asides to preferential source categories. Is that kind of what you were saying?
That's what I was alluding to earlier. And in the case of said companies, having those...
Actually, we use the microphone.
Sorry, I thought I was talking loud enough. But I alluded earlier to the fact that those preferences be given allowance-wise to non-EGUs and EGUs of substantial competence, and any other, choice to want to then request less allowances purposely for a non-EGU, something less substantial than an EGU, if that can be incentivized. If people are going out of the way to say, I'll do less, and then...
Okay, I think I understand. Bill?
Thank you. Well, Doug had his hand up here.
Bill has the mic already.
All right, Bill. Then Doug.
I talked before, I'll keep it. I'm going to summarize what I said with EGUs since I was out of turn. When a new fossil fuel source is proposed, it should be the most efficient, reasonably available. And there are three ways to build off of the department's existing authorities in rules and legislation. One is to update the state-of-the-art manuals for fuel burning sources to explicitly include energy efficiency. Two is to update the general permits to include energy efficiency. And three is to consider lower thresholds for requiring state-of-the-art and requiring state-of-the-art, also requiring best energy efficiency as part of that.
Doug O'Malley, Environment New Jersey. I wanted to focus my questions on 4 and 5. How does each option affect public health? And number 5, what's the effect on environmentally burdened areas? And specifically, I wanted to focus on industrial non-EGUs, although this obviously is applicable to EGUs as well. My quick thought on this is, and I hope this should be shared by the department, is that not all carbon is created equal. And obviously there's been a long legacy of using the justification of industrial facilities in environmental justice communities to permit additional industrial facilities, both non-EGU and EGU. Clearly, there has been an effort by the department through EO23 to address environmental justice. And so my question is, will the department use these carbon regulations as a way to reduce carbon emissions first and foremost in environmental justice communities? And as a point of reference, obviously the department not only has EO23 to guide it, but many stakeholders in this room were at the Senate Environment Committee hearing yesterday on Senator Singleton's bill that referenced the importance of cumulative impacts, which should be incorporated in this decision. And then finally, if Nikki Sheets was here from the Environmental Justice Alliance, he would also be referencing the importance of reducing co-pollutants and not just carbon. So I wanted to get a sense of where the department is on whether EJ communities will be prioritized for carbon reductions.
Quick answer, Doug, is yes. So it's not just this rule, it's any rule going forward that's going to be the focus. And what's 1770, what's the number now? They changed the number, 232. If that goes through, that would even add further focus on it. But certainly for this rule and all the ones we're doing going forward, the environmentally burdened areas will be a focus, no question.
And that's to be assumed based on EO23. And I guess my question is what is the thinking in the department on incorporating cumulative impact? What's the thinking on incorporating the available public health data, which is obviously kind of well known, at least on air quality? How is the department going to put a thumb on the scale to be prioritizing emissions, both carbon and not, in EJ communities?
Right. Well, a big piece of the stakeholdering is that we're not just talking about limiting it. We're talking about, or where to set thresholds. We're talking about how to handle these overburdened communities and do it appropriately. So that's part of the discussion. We certainly welcome input.
Right. And Doug, I think you really hit on one very important point, and I'll just reiterate it, is the concept of a co-benefit associated with a carbon reduction strategy, and that there are co-benefits associated with reductions in certain fossil fuels or all fossil fuels associated with it. So it can be criteria pollutant co-benefits such as NOx and VOC emission reductions. It can be hazardous air pollutants from reductions in heavier fuel oils. It can be black carbon associated with the combustion of some of the liquid fuels. So again, keeping in mind that the important point I think you're making is that co-benefits can impact environmentally overburdened communities, or any community, any host community can be impacted by those other pollutants, and there are co-benefits associated with reducing those fossil fuels.
And because Frank is an airhead, there are other environmental benefits. There are co-benefits as well.
Thank you.
Satish Pushpala, Phillips 66. I want to comment on
option one. For our industry, the fuel switching is, really, it doesn't fit for us. But, we can do things on the efficiency side. As a matter of fact, we have an application with the department right now. Use of our excess gas, at a neighboring facility to, make energy and, produce electricity and, in the process, back out, emissions from our facility. So, in my opinion, I think that fits in, very well with the short-term goals the department has. And, we're working with the department right now to get that permit approved and hope that, we can work together on that aspect.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Okay, Jeff.
Thanks. I want to follow up on the overburdened communities. One of the things that, concerns me when I hear about allowances, one, allowance system doesn't work unless there's any market system without a regulatory backup. It doesn't work, or the threat of regulations. But New York put in a policy that through the allowance system or cap and trade that you could not increase pollution in overburdened communities doing that. And that would be something I would like to see in any type of rule that we would have. Because one of the problems we have now is, we saw this happen with NOx, where a plant closes in Connecticut, which has no impact on our airshed, and they bring the credits to New Jersey to increase NOx, and so we get a localized impact, and the region might be doing better, but the localized region gets hurt. So, so that is one part, and then the second part is, again, within large industrial facilities, to look at the fugitive emissions. That comes up, sometimes those spikes are, as big as that. And then my last is, I don't know if it really belongs here, if we're going to get into like smaller things, but California requires all compressor stations to be enclosed and to only use electric motors, as an example, to keep down, because they're a major source of NOx.
Can I ask you to hold that thought?
Okay.
Hold
that one, but so the
hold
other
that
two.
thought, because
Right.
we'll talk a little bit about electrification. We will. But yeah, just as Jeff, as just a reaction, based on the litigation that we're currently suing EPA over on an allowance program, the CASPER program, the department does share concerns with allowance programs being properly designed to reduce emissions and not lead to just funding something and emitting the same as usual. So the department does share that concern.
And also sometimes these reductions are really paper reductions and not real reductions, and then we end up trading.
Understood.
Becomes sort of Bernie Madoff versus EPA.
Understood.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. We have three folks lined up along the wall there. Go ahead, Christine.
Grant Lucking with the Builders Association. My comment relates to the residential sector specifically. And I think cost needs to be a factor, not only from an economic perspective, but also from an environmental perspective. Half of our housing stock was built before 1960. It's terribly energy inefficient. Anytime we can build a new housing unit that replaces an old housing unit, and in the case of redevelopment, which is becoming increasingly common, the energy efficiency gains are massive, especially with advances in the code process and developers choosing to go voluntarily above code. So at some point, cost increases do decrease demand, and I don't know where that nexus is, but it should be a consideration.
Thank you.
Gerald Foley, Department of Energy, CHP Technical Assistance Partnership. So I just want to put CHP back on the table.
Yep, absolutely.
And I think it is a little more broader. So yes, clearly for industrial is an obvious one, but somewhat limited in the amount of deployment. All of the new development in CHP is really in institutional hospitals, larger facilities. Tremendous amount of development in New York on multifamily residential, and has been in New Jersey. About half of the CHP plants are in multifamily. So it provides resiliency as well as efficiency, and it's a cost efficiency that's driving that development. But clearly cost and emissions from a CHP perspective are, it's almost a 1-for-1 in terms of reduction.
Right.
So as a short term, I think it's broader based than just industrial. I think that should be recognized. The Energy Master Plan does talk about microgrids, which really puts a new face on combined heat and power to some extent as a key component in delivering that energy to a microgrid that's, residential, small commercial potentially. And then finally, there is a fair bit of work with two fairly significant engine manufacturers currently using hydrogen as a fuel source. So these engines can be converted to hydrogen, either reciprocating engines or combustion turbines can be converted to combustion of hydrogen. Some technical pros and cons to be worked out, but it's certainly in the long term potential carbon-free delivery of thermal and electric.
Yeah, just to acknowledge one of our other stakeholders who had a really good analogy a few years ago. Dave, if you remember a couple of years ago, we were discussing combined heat and power, and in the context of replacement, not new, replacing an existing source. If you were replacing a boiler plus the electricity provided on the grid with a much cleaner combined heat and power, the analogy I think you used was going from an incandescent bulb to an LED bulb. Yes, there's still emissions from it, but there are potential emission reductions when you're doing a replacement. So again, I would caution to say if you're replacing the existing sources with combined heat and power, there's real emission reductions potential. If you're just building a new one, the question is you're actually not displacing any emissions. So.
Klaus Rittenbach, Climate Action New Jersey. So addressing question number one and some of the others also, and also going back to your previous slide where you talked about the various non-EGU sources. It looked like about 70% of that is for space heating, based on my previous question. Does that sound about right? 70% of that is used for space heating, just very roughly? No?
No, I would say maybe for the residential, probably most of the residential is going to be space heating. For commercial and industrial, I'm going to say it's definitely not. In the aggregate.
All right, well, anyway,
Yeah.
Okay, so even for residential, so, yeah, so the solution for that's been around in Europe for a long time and is starting to go in New York State and even a little bit in New Jersey is passive house construction and zero energy homes, that kind of thing. So that typically reduces the space heating or the total energy demand by 80 to 90%. So my question is, to what extent can the DEP incentivize and promote these types of constructions, for new buildings and for retrofits? To what extent does DEP have a role to play in that?
Sorry, I was waiting for, if you're going to be coming on that. So was going to ask a couple questions, but I want to address the point that you raised, Frank. So in terms of, replacing something that's dirty or more dirty with something less dirty, I think it's important to understand the time frame and the magnitude. If we're talking a need to reduce, emissions by 5 or 10%, that's one thing. But the magnitude of the thing we're talking about is another. And even if we fundamentally disagree that frac gas is cleaner than coal, so I think it's very disputable that anything gas is replacing is actually cleaner. But separate from that, even if it was cleaner, that pipeline and that gas plant isn't going to be going away quietly in 5 or 10 or 15 years. So you have to look at the long term. You have to look at the stranded costs. And it's all well and good to say that's on the shareholder, but I'll believe the state forces the shareholders to eat those stranded costs as opposed to the public when it happens. And if you look at the history of the state, we don't make that happen. Ratepayers eat that cost, and that's money that has to be spent elsewhere. We don't have that kind of luxury. Onto the questions. When you're looking at costs, at what level of costs are you looking at? Are you looking at whole life cycle, internalizing externalities? So when you're looking at, what are the costs to reduce this particular project for this amount of CO2? Are you looking at the co-pollutants that also get reduced with that and all the associated benefits that come with that? When you're looking at jobs, are you just looking at jobs that are lost when that gas plant shuts down? Or are you looking at also the jobs that are created because it's being replaced with offshore wind or solar, et cetera? So you
Dave,
could elaborate on how expansive or not you're looking at that.
Can I ask you, rather than posing that as a question, can you state that back to me as something the department should be doing?
How would I do that? Department should be looking inclusively at costs, internalizing externalities on climate, on health, on property damage losses avoided, on insurance costs reduced, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you, Dave.
Hi, Sue Dorward, Raritan Valley Community College. My comment is about low carbon concrete. Concrete is kind of a special case. It has emissions through the flue, but it also has emissions from the creation of the cement in Portland cement. And so those emissions are not captured in what you regulate. They're just happening. And I don't have a good sense of how that could be combined in terms of total emissions, and how to evaluate or how concrete plants may need to pay for their emissions. But low carbon concrete has been, it's starting to be addressed in New York State. They recently introduced some legislation that's now in committee to prioritize low carbon concrete for state procured buildings. And then there's also, it's already in New Jersey, there's a company called Solidia that is one of the low carbon concrete companies, one of the leaders, and they are able to reduce CO2 emissions by 70%, but that's because they use less water, less energy, they produce a smaller, they produce a stronger material, and so that reduces the emissions. So just the focus on the flue gas
So to
is
clarify,
just a piece.
yeah, just to clarify, there are no cement kilns in New Jersey currently. All of the cement that is brought into the concrete plants and the cement plants is actually brought in from out of state.
Okay.
So absolutely, the CO2 emissions from cement kilns is of concern, should be of concern, but we do not have cement kilns in New Jersey. We do have cement plants where they mix them and prepare them and load them into the trucks. Yes, we do have that. We do have asphalt plants in New Jersey that have significant emissions. But again, we do not have any cement kilns in the state.
Okay, thank you.
We have comment over here. Before I just want to take a quick commercial break, just only to say that we're at 11:35. We were going to take an early lunch break. I know that there's still comments on short-term strategies. I'm proposing to the group that we wrap up at noon with short-term or a little after noon, and then after lunch we'll start in with long-term strategies, and there's two categories. How does that sit with everybody if we break it up like that? Okay, I see a thumbs up.
Does anybody strongly object to going and eating so we can refuel before we come back? I'll state it differently. Can we take a shorter lunch break in an hour? Well, let's see how long it takes before we get to break, and certainly as a suggestion, Eric, that would be a great suggestion. But let's see if we can get through this short term, and then we'll get to break, and we'll see how everyone feels, because maybe by then you'll want an extra long lunch. Oh, that's Ray is speaking from experience here. The lines in the cafeteria will get longer, so that's a good point, Ray.
So it's 20 of. Do you want to go for 10 more minutes on short term and do 10 of 12? Want to meet back here at 12:30? I mean, what does my counterparts think?
So I will say, unless somebody objects, that's amicable to me personally, because then I can run upstairs and do about 75 emails during lunch because I checked my emails.
Okay. Now we're going to go 10 of 12 and we back at 12:30. Okay, now we're returning to the hands that were up.
Okay, Judy Minot again, Jersey Sierra Club. I just wanted to point out that in the consideration of all of these questions, we often talk about cost as a negative. In other words, increasing costs is a negative, and particularly the industry representatives that are here. But increasing costs can be actually a positive in many cases. For example, in avoiding unintended consequences. You look at LED light bulbs, for example, they're much cheaper, there are many energy efficiencies, and yet the result in many cases is that people just light things more. And we've seen the same in California when they introduced more energy efficient housing regulations, and all that happened was people built bigger houses. So I just want to point out that that should be something not to be not considered, is that if something increased costs, that it could be not such a negative. Unfortunately, the unavoidable issue is that that has a higher impact on environmental justice communities when costs of energy are increased. And so we need to struggle with that issue as well.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Barb Blumenthal from New Jersey Conservation. I just had a thought about the cement issue, which is, I'm curious whether the department is considering regulating some activities that may not currently exist in the state, but if they did, they would be a major source of
CO2?
CO2.
Right.
And whether that's within the purview of the department to go beyond, or whether that would require legislation, because it's another form of leakage. You know, we have some industries that don't sit in New Jersey, and yet we consume their products. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about sort of the regional impact of some of these industrial uses.
So sources that might be coming into the state that would be coming in for an air permit would be evaluated, the major source thresholds, which we could talk about in detail. But if a source of a new cement kiln were to come into state and was a major facility, it would be evaluated for the best available control technology for carbon dioxide.
This is Doug O'Malley from Environment New Jersey. I wanted to follow up specifically on the question number 3 and number 6. What options are best for the environment, and what is the social impact for each option? ? Jobs. And I wanted to make a larger comment that climate isn't listed there. It's inferred through environment, and in some ways it's inferred through social impact. And certainly jobs is not the only externality and not the only economic cost. And specifically, I wanted to reference the language in EO 100, which includes research that the department put out via Rutgers University on the increased sea level rise that we expect in 2030, 2050, and 2100, as well as the Rhodium Group research, which showed an economic cost of $60 billion from increased extreme weather, flooding, and sea level rise. And I wanted to, ask the department how are those costs from climate impacts going to be incorporated into rulemaking? And then just as a broader comment around this, I previously had referenced the letter which we submitted with close to 100 groups referencing the UN climate science, which obviously means that we need to not have business as usual. We need to see a 45% reduction over the course of this coming decade, which, just looking at the carbon emissions for the state, would mean that we need to emit only a little over 15 million metric tons, which would mean both the EGUs and the non-EGU sector. We need to see tremendous cuts. And so, this is not kind of an ancillary point. If the department is going to be following through on the climate science, it needs to incorporate these true externalities that the research the department has conducted. And so I wanted to ask how much, not only through this stakeholder process, but through the rulemaking, will the research the department has been doing be a lodestar or a north star for the rulemaking that will come?
To guide the rulemaking to come. So Doug, I'm not going to answer with a question, but to keep in mind that part of what the department is doing and is attempting to do is we've got a lot of irons in the fire. This first stakeholdering process is looking at things that we can do right now. But keep in mind, we also have a Global Warming Response Act report that is going to be coming out, which is going to be making recommendations. Now, I can't say exactly what it's going to recommend, but the legislation is clear that the recommendations must be there to either identify the paths that will get us to 80% reduction, or if there's strategies that will get us there that need legislative changes, it's to recommend those. So in terms of our North Star to guide us, we've got a lot of things going on. One is the Global Warming Response Act 2050 report. That's one. We've also got a greenhouse gas reporting rule, which is going to give us an even more informative. We may have to keep periodically updating that 2050 report. And in terms of interim goals, we've heard the community loud and clear that there should be interim goals. We haven't established interim goals yet. So as I said before, we had 2020 and 2050. Everybody can draw a straight line between the two. But what we're trying to do is to do everything we can at this point with the guidance we have at this point, with the directives we have at this point. And part of that is the Energy Master Plan. And part of the Energy Master Plan is the transition away from fossil fuels. And again, we've structured this entire discussion around what can we do short term, and we're going to talk more after lunch about what are potential strategies for long term, meaning what will get us there. I don't know if any of these strategies that we've talked about this morning get us to 80%. In fact, I know they don't. But we have to start with what we can do now and continue to build on that through time. And the regulatory process is what it is in terms of there's no set regulation of what needs to be included in a cost-benefit analysis. So every time I hear a comment back that externalities associated with the impacts of climate change, that helps inform the department in its rulemaking. So again, we're acknowledging a lot of the comments and a lot of the things saying, yes, thank you, thank you, thank you. We're hearing you. We're writing it down. We're going to continue to do that. The Office of Science, along with academic institutions, is continuing to look at impacts of climate change because that is the fulcrum on which our scale is. You have the environmental impacts and its cost, along with the cost to get to where 2050 is calling us. And that is a balancing act at some point. And that is the reality we are in. That said, this is the start. It's not the end. We might be getting to the end of the beginning, but it's definitely not the end.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Yasmin Passar, and I'm here representing the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. I just had a question, and I'm not sure really if this fits into this discussion for today or for another discussion, but when it comes to aviation and CO2 emissions and other pollutants that come from that, we mentioned diesel fuel earlier on in our discussion. Does the DEP regulate what goes to airports? Does it regulate at all what comes from aircrafts or from airports at all in the state of New Jersey? And if so, is that included in your plan moving forward? Is it not? Is it?
Stationary sources at the airports, either through the Port Authority or through their tenants, do currently have air permits. So they are potentially subject to the regulations. Now, the airplanes themselves are not currently regulated by the department or their fuels. The ground support equipment is non-road mobile equipment. So it moves around, but it currently does not require an air permit. So again, when we talk mobile sources, we all automatically go to the on-road, the highway, the light-duty vehicles, the trucks. But there are other categories of sources in that mobile source category, and one of them is ground support equipment. Now, I know the Port Authority has approached the department in partnering to electrify that sort of equipment. Again, that's outside of the scope about where we're talking today, but that shouldn't cut off discussion on looking at non-road mobile sources and potential emission reductions or conversions of those sources pursuant to the Energy Master Plan to non-fossil fuel power.
Okay, what I'd like to do is end this discussion on the morning part. We will stick to the agreement. It's 10 of 12. We'll meet back here at 12:30. If anyone didn't bring something to eat or snack on, we do have a cafeteria. If you've not been here before, it's just through the lobby and follow the hall.
Today they have meatloaf and mashed potatoes. I had my assistant check, so if you're a meatloaf